Put God first.
Your presence in their lives gives them validation.
Our children don't need us to be superheroes.
If you do these things, the next generation and the generations that follow will live in a world far better than the one we have today.
Men, stand up, be fathers.
Hey guys, it's Mark, your host and founder of The Inspired Legacy. As always, this is the show that equips and inspires men just like you to unleash your inner lion and reveal your true purpose as spiritual leaders in the home. Today, I'm excited for my conversation. I say that all the time, but it's true. I'm excited for this conversation. Today, I've got Mitch Matthews on the show. He's the creator of the Dream, Think, Do podcast. He's also a success coach, serial entrepreneur, and a best-selling author. But most importantly, he's a husband and a dad and a lifelong learner living in Des Moines, Iowa, just down the road from us here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His weekly Dream, Think, Do podcast helps people around the world to dream bigger, think better, and do more of what they were created to do. His show has been rated #1 by the Huffington Post and is in Apple Podcasts' top 5%. So I think you could probably call him a little bit of a big deal in the podcast space. Through his podcast, books, coaching, and speaking, Mitch brings a unique perspective of what it takes to turn dreams into a reality and create more of the life that you want to live, which is a big component of why we exist, why the Inspired Legacy exists. So Mitch, welcome to the show, man.
Mark, thank you so much. It's such an honor.
Absolutely. I've been a longtime listener of your podcast, and this is kind of why you're on the show today. I heard an episode from you, I think it was actually last year, and I favorited it in my little app. I'm like, that's a topic that I want to dive into deeper. So we're going to get there. But before we do, I mentioned that you're a husband and a father. Real quick, just kind of give us your dad bio, like how long you've been married, how many kids you got, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So it's funny. I always told God that I was going to be 40 when I got married. Right? Find the woman of my dreams when I was in my 40s. That's when I was going to settle down. I travel the world, start some businesses, all that stuff leading up to it. God giggled, I think, and I got married at 22. I met the woman of my dreams basically at 20, and he rearranged my DNA to say, hey, it's pretty good, isn't it? So I proposed and we got married, and we have been happily married for, oh my gosh, now I'm going to have to do math, but it's about 27, 28 years. And we have two dudes, one's 19, one's 21. They're both home with us right now, but in non-pandemic times, our older son has his own business. He still lives at home right now, but it's because he's an entrepreneur and he's starting his business.
Sure.
And our younger son lives in LA now and is at an acting school out there.
Oh, wow. That's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. They both actually, our older son has a film production company and that kind of thing. So it's kind of fun to look back on. They neither one of them were like fantastic at sports, a little bit like their dad, kind of had a unique perspective on the world. And at 8 and 10, I asked them, what do you guys want to do? Because the football thing wasn't happening, the soccer thing wasn't happening all that much. And I was like, what do you guys like? And they're like, we like Legos and we like cartoons and we like, watching movies. And I was like, well, why don't we combine those and make a movie? And so the first movie that we made was, they were 8 and 10, and we made a Lego stop motion movie, which we very quickly figured out that's not an easy or a fun way to make a movie. So
that's
that was
a lot of work.
Our one and only Lego stop motion film. But then we worked together. They wrote a film together, which was a pretty simple plot at that time, but it was a whole lot of fun. I shot it on our little flip camera. I don't know if you remember those flip cameras, the one button little jobbies. And we shot that. And what's amazing is that that dream kind of got quiet for a little while, but then it came back in spades when they were both in high school. They made 30 plus short films since. They've won awards for them. Oh, wow. Our older son really likes to be behind the camera. Our younger son likes to be in front of the camera. So it's a really neat thing that God's done, and I've just gotten to play a part of it.
What a great way to have fun, but also expose them to possibilities that exist out there.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it was kind of one of those times where what was fun was I didn't have any experience with making movies, none. And what was fun about that was it was kind of scary territory because, I'd always kind of thought as a dad, I'm supposed to know everything and teach my children. And it was so freeing to move into that season because what I realized was I don't have to know everything. We're just going to learn it together. And so that's what we did. Like we started to, try to figure out, okay, how do you write a script? And they're 8 and 10. So they weren't, so what we did was I just created some, blocks on a piece of paper and said, let's make a comic book. I think it seems like they storyboard everything. So let's just make a comic book. So they drew out a good story in comic book form and then we shot it. So, it was fun to get to learn that together. And then that's kind of how we've just progressed through a lot of the things that we've gotten to do.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
We got a lot to cover here. I have a feeling you've got a lot to share. So we're just going to dive into it. I think it's safe to say that most of the guys listening know that what and who we surround ourselves with shape our beliefs, right? And what we believe about ourselves, what we tell ourselves each and every day also shape our beliefs. And our beliefs dictate our actions and how we experience life. So if you're believing negative things about who you are and what you're capable of, this head trash that, by the way, we all battle with, right? This head trash is one of the greatest contributors, in my opinion, to what holds us back from becoming who God designed us to be. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be intentional about what we believe in and what we believe about ourselves if we're truly going to, as I say, unleash our lion and live like warriors in a world that honestly just constantly feeds us lies. And Mitch, I know you've got a practical tool and method that you're going to share with us about how we can overcome this. And that's has to do with personal, or rather intentional, identity statements. So I just want to kind of turn the mic over to you at this point. Just unpack that concept. What is an intentional identity statement?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I love that you connected with that particular episode. And it's one that's I've had a love-hate relationship with because, I've read a lot of the success literature that's out there and people are big fans. They really promote kind of these statements, the mantras that you might say in the morning. You look in the mirror and you say all these things kind of as a pump up session. Yeah. Those just never resonated with me. They never felt genuine. And they always kind of felt like, okay, like, I kind of wanted to do the double finger guns back to myself. Like, okay, you don't really believe this, right? So it's that whole thing, but it's really an interesting thing to dive into because to your point, we are talking to ourselves all the time. Yeah. A lot of times we might be aware of that, but most of that is at a subconscious level. We just don't realize it. But it's, if you look at the experts and they say we're saying thousands of statements to ourselves. We're reinforcing certain beliefs thousands of times a day. And most of the time we're not aware of it. So I started to kind of take a look at this from the standpoint of, okay, successful organizations have identity statements, right? It's those things. And you see those organizations where if a member of an organization can state their identity statement, right? And state it with conviction, you can tell that organization is probably going to be more successful, especially if that person really connects with that, right? Yeah. Yep. And I started to think through that. And what's interesting is I did it wrong first. I started to just throw out a bunch of no's and nots. Like I am a recovering worrier. Okay. So that was one of my first target areas. Like I've been, a black belt level, ninja level worrier in my past, like worrying myself to, sickness as a kid, so much so that I would like stay home from school and not kind of like my tummy's upset. It was like really dangerously ill sometimes. And like for weeks at a time. And, so I had to learn some different strategies. And one of the things was, I tried to like use this strategy of, okay, I'm going to have these statements that I'm going to say to myself and I'm going to believe those statements. And they tended to start with nots. Like, I am not a worrier. I am not going to worry today. And what's interesting is that those don't work on a couple of different levels. One is when you say statements, reinforcing statements, your brain doesn't tend to be good at identifying the nots and the no's. it kind of jumps over those. So if you're saying I'm not a worrier, your brain typically hears I'm a worrier.
Oh,
right. So that's a problem.
Yep.
But the other problem is, I think and I always say, I love Jesus, but I cuss a little bit. And so one of the things I always say is our brains, and I think it's God's perfect design, our brains have an incredible BS detector, right? To be able to say, nope, not buying it. And that was the other problem with these no and not statements, was I could look in the mirror and say, I'm not a worrier. Or maybe I didn't even want to take it to the mirror. I just wanted to kind of say that throughout the day if I started to feel worry start to happen. I would start to say these, well, I'm not going to worry today.
Yeah.
Right. And the not thing didn't work with my brain, but my brain was also like, I'm not believing that. Like there's no way, I'm not buying it. Right. Because I very much knew that I was a worrier. So that seemed incongruent. It seemed disingenuous. It seemed inauthentic. It didn't seem powerful. That's for sure. And so I started to look at it differently. And one of the things was to be able to say, all right, what do I want to believe that's bigger than my worries? And, what do I want to believe that could be true, even if I was feeling fear? Right. And I know for me, and I know a lot of your listeners are probably, Bible guys, right? Or like they either read the Bible or they're affiliated with the Bible or, can appreciate the Bible, that kind of thing. And one of the things that was really empowering for me is I love the stories in the Bible. I'm not great at remembering scripture. I've got friends that are just amazing. I could say, James 1, and they can just, just repeat back a bunch of, great scripture. I'm not great at that, but I'm really good at story. And I love diving into the stories of the Bible. And one of the things that's been so empowering on this front is I've started to dig into the subtleties of the stories, right? And one of my favorite stories is Joshua, right? And you look at Joshua's history. I mean, he's next to Moses. He was Moses' right-hand man. He was an established warrior. He was the one tapped to lead the Israelites into the promised land when they finally got to do it, right? And in Joshua chapter 1, what I love about that is that, it's when God's saying, all right, it's go time, Joe, it's time to go in. It's time to make this thing happen. God had to say to him repeatedly, be bold, be courageous, right? And you don't say that to somebody who's already confident, right? Like that was a very revealing thing to me to go, okay, this guy was tapped to be a leader. He'd been encouraged by Moses. He'd been, God had talked to him. God had made promises 40 years prior when he came back from the promised land and said, yes, God says, right? But even when it was go time, God had to say, be bold and courageous. So I'm like, all right, maybe that means Joshua was afraid, but he did it anyway.
Yeah.
God loved him. God still tapped him. God still said, I'm calling you. And I think one of the most important things of that story was God wasn't saying, be bold and courageous, good luck. Or be bold and courageous. I'll see you on the other side with a gentle punch to the shoulder. He's like, be bold and courageous because I'm with you.
Right. Exactly.
And that started to become more of my identity statement of being able to say, all right, if I'm right, if I'm wrong, if I'm scared, if I'm bold, if I'm brave, wherever I'm at, God is with me. So I'm going to try to listen to him. And if I feel like I'm supposed to go, I'm going to go.
Yeah.
And even if I'm making a mistake, I know God's going to be with me and he'll redeem the things that I do wrong. Right. It's that whole thing of being able to say, I'm going to do my best and I'm going to remember that God's with me. So it wasn't a matter of trying to convince myself I wasn't afraid or that I wasn't going to worry. It was to be able to say, yep, I'm feeling fear. Yes, I am tempted to worry, but I'm going to anyway, right? Like whatever that is, I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah. And I could really start to, especially for me, and this isn't for everybody, but I think for your audience will appreciate it. Like, especially if those belief statements were going to be rooted in scripture, they were so true, they held true, even if, an opposite feeling was also present, And so it was one of those things where I would be able to remember those stories. And that's what I love about, the Bible and Jewish culture it was a story-based culture. So, if you asked someone, in Jesus' time or in, the times of the Old Testament, who is God? They wouldn't try to describe God. They would tell you a story.
Right.
Well, God did this. God set us free. God split the sea. God, helps us in the promised land. God, all these things. Right. And So it was just one of those things where I realized from an identity standpoint, if my identity is based on that, then I'm probably in good ground.
Yeah.
But then I also realized, like, sometimes like I said, a lot of this happens at a subconscious level. So sometimes I have to shorten that up. Like sometimes I can combat those feelings with a good story, right? And remember, sometimes it's just being able to say, yeah, I feel fear, but I eat challenges for breakfast. Or like we have a team of people and we go to, we'll have events or, sometimes we'll have all day video projects and I'll be like, guys, let's handle today like we're freaking Navy SEALs. And it's that whole thing of like, yeah, there's going to be challenges because we're human, because we're navigating the world, because of all these things. Let's repeat some of these things to help us remember who we are. And, and some of my team are total Jesus people. Some of my team are not, right? And so I have to use language that translates, that lets them know that I love them. But if they're not, building their life on a biblical foundation, I'm not going to cast them out, right? Like they could be a great team member and I can also be a radical curiosity to them. And so I got to find ways to make these things translate to people that maybe don't have that same foundation.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. So that's been huge to be able to say, all right, they're oftentimes based on scripture and based on story. And then also sometimes I try to shorten them, make them more concise so that when I start to feel my subconscious go, because the enemy's good and he's good at what he's horrible, right? But he's very good at what he does.
He is.
Right. But I don't want to give him too much credit because sometimes it's absolutely the enemy trying to ping me or trying to whisper in my ear. And then sometimes it's just my subconscious.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's past memories, right? I don't want to give the enemy too much credit. So sometimes it's just a bad habit. It's just an old belief. And I have to root those things out and go after them. And identity statements are a powerful way to do that.
Yeah. And just from a practical standpoint, just like a corporate mission statement, if it's too long, people aren't going to remember it and they're not going to employ it in their day to day.
Exactly.
And if your identity statements are too long, you're not going to remember them. And in those moments of weakness, you're not going to be able to recall it and fight the devil in those circumstances. So it's a good reminder. And I love the biblical references because you're absolutely right. Some of the greatest characters in the Bible, Moses, for example, when God told him to go back and free his people and he's like, well, God, I'm not a good speaker.
Right.
How am I gonna confront Pharaoh? So it's just a good reminder. So I got a question for you. So it sounds like it's a subtle shift from, because you mentioned our brains are good BS detectors. A subtle shift from filtering everything through a negative filter to a positive one. But how do we avoid just telling ourselves lies? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
absolutely. Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I think, I think it's a great question because it's one of those, I think that's one of the other potential ditches of this line of thinking, right? It's kind of that, if I look at my garden and there's weeds everywhere, but if I close my eyes and say, there's no weeds, there's no weeds, there's no weeds in God's economy, right? Like God can do amazing things, but he doesn't call us to magic thinking.
True. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
I think he calls us to close our eyes sometimes and imagine a garden with no weeds and then open our eyes and get to work.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Right?
I like that. Yeah.
It's a little bit like, you look at the story. Going back to Joshua, he let the Israelites, they get freed as slaves. They still have slave thinking.
Yep.
Right. They still have, most of them have been slaves all of their lives up to this point. And God gives them this opportunity. It's what I call a 14v40 decision, because where the Israelites were at when they got to send the scouts into the promised land. And when those scouts came back, right, they spent 40 days in the promised land. God let them go and see it. He let them get a vision for the promised land.
Yep,
right.
Yep.
And in that time, they came back and two of the scouts, Joshua and Caleb, said yes. Actually, Caleb was the bold one. Josh was just next to Caleb, right? But if you really look at the story, Caleb's like, hey, watermelons the size of grapes, grapes the size of watermelons. It is the land of milk and honey. By the way, there are walled cities, giants, all that stuff. Yes, but God says, let's go, right?
Yeah.
10 came back and said, all those things are true, and we look like ants compared. They even started to make stuff up, like we heard, or we believe that they were saying we look like ants, right? They were even making things up about what they had seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's that whole thing of at that point where they were at, they were 14 days walk, by some standards 11, but 14 to 11 days walk from the promised land. They said no. And so they had to spend 40 years in the desert. And I think we get faced with 14v40 decisions all the time. And it's like, if I'm going to ask that question, right? Like, okay, do I say yes? Do I say no? Do I believe God could be with me? It's kind of that, do I want to have a 2-scout heart or a 10-scout heart? Right. And that doesn't mean being crazy. I don't believe in, blind leaps of faith all the time, but I do believe in steps of faith over time.
Yeah.
And that's what I think God's calling us to. So it's kind of identifying, all right, what are those questions I'm asking myself? And how big is God in my response?
Yeah. I like that. You got to be willing to receive the vision. And like you said, it may not be reality in that moment, but knowing that with some work and some dedication, it can become reality.
Yep.
I love it. So walk us through this, practically speaking, because I love to give guys like nuggets they can walk away with. Like what are some practical ways that you can implement this into your life?
Absolutely. So I'm a journaling kind of guy. Do you journal, Mark?
I do. I'm not as good at it as I would like to be, but yes.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not a pretty journal guy, and I'm definitely not a my dear diary kind of guy. My journal entries look a lot more like bullet points.
Mine are
you know
bullet
what I mean?
points.
Like
exactly,
I never apparently, it's taken years and years. Like people are still dissecting George Washington's journals. That guy was an incredibly eloquent journaler. Thomas Jefferson, same thing. Like absolute, like prose. No one is ever going to dissect the poetry of Mitch Matthews journaling. No way.
Well, those guys didn't have Netflix to distract them all.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. I can look back on my journals though, and like I'll remember. I always say my journaling is to help me remember what I'm talking to God about. Help me to remember maybe what I was afraid of, what I was excited about, what I'm doing, those kinds of things, right? And they've been so powerful in that regard because I can go back. My journals are all on one shelf of my bookshelf, and they've got dates on them from when to when I started, when I completed them, and I can go back, open them up, and it's fun to see how God has kind of worked through some of those entries to be very revealing to things I believed to be true in the past, where I've either changed my mind or God showed me something else entirely, those kinds of things, but. I think journaling can be a really powerful first step in this because a big part of the battle in regards to what we are going to believe happens at a subconscious level. But one of the things that we can do to kind of grab some of those beliefs and some of those subconscious thoughts out of kind of that place where they're impacting us, but we're not doing it intentionally. One of the best ways to do that is to just grab those thoughts. So I keep a journal with me. And I've got one section, especially if I'm going to really focus on this. If I feel like I've moved into a time where I'm having a lot of doubt or I'm having a lot of worries or I'm having a lot of concern, what I'll do is I'll like keep a journal with me, and I pretty much do all the time, but I have a special section in the back. I'll even just, take a little Post-it note and mark that section. And what I'll do is if I'm having doubts, right? Or if I'm having fears or if I'm having worries, what I will do is if I'm feeling them, and you probably get this too, like a lot of times it's like, it's not obvious initially. I'll just start to have that feeling in my gut, or I'll start to have that sense, right? And it won't be like, oh, well, I am intentionally worrying about, blank today. It's just like, where did I lose my peace? Where did I lose my joy? What am I starting to worry about? What am I tempted? And that's one of the powerful questions I ask myself is, what am I tempted to worry about right now? What am I tempted to believe right now? And I write it down. And sometimes it's very real and it's understandable. Other times it's almost craziness, like, oh my gosh, I'm worried about that, but that makes no sense, but it was just creeping in,
Yep.
So writing it down is a great first practical step, whether it feels real or not, acknowledging it. It's a little bit like, when we were kids and we were worried about whatever was in the closet and mom or dad would come in the room, flick on the lights, and you're like, oh, It was grandma's fur coat this whole time. Like, are you kidding me? Right. It just, in the light, it loses so much of its power. Oftentimes, same thing happens with our beliefs. If we write them down, sometimes they might even seem laughable, especially with a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Now, you might actually also be having some real concerns. You might have health concerns or financial concerns or stuff going on with your career. Those might be very real, right? So to still write them down. And I always say, hey, I'm writing them down to acknowledge they're on my mind, they're on my heart. And that's kind of also the first step to just say, Lord, I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do with it, but by writing them down, I'm also giving them to you. Right. So it's kind of like, we as believers get to kind of double dip because we get to acknowledge them. But as we do that, we're also giving them up to God. Now, people who just believe in the science and the neurology of this really believe in the writing it down part. So we can agree on that. They may, not necessarily get on board with the whole giving them up to God thing, but we know that's nitro, right? Like
right.
that's where the real difference happens, right? But it starts with acknowledging those fears, those doubts, those beliefs, all of those things. It could also be like, what are those statements that got placed there? I know early on in junior high, I had a math teacher tell me that I was never going to be good at math, right? Kind of joked with me, but I knew what he was saying. And it was a bit of a power play. It hurt people. And so I think it made him feel good to kind of make fun of me in front of the class, all that stuff. Well, all of a sudden I started to have a belief that I wasn't going to be good in math, and my grades reflected that.
Yep.
And what's interesting is that later on, I actually had a logic class in the philosophy department. And I got an A+ in it. Now that was math, but it was math using words. And it was something that, God used then to displace that belief. And now I'm actually I shouldn't say I like the new math. I like math. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's that whole thing of realizing like, wow, for a long time, I believed I wasn't good at math because of something somebody said. Right. And that happens to us a lot.
Happens all the time.
I'm not good at sales. Really? Okay. That, write it down, right?
Yeah.
That might be something you say maybe, but sales might be something you need to be able to do.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things is to write it down. The next thing is to be able to say, all right, Lord, what do you want me to know about that? What's a truth you'd like me to see? And sometimes when you ask yourself that question, he might bring a memory to mind, especially if you give him a little space, a little bit of time, right? It's not, we're not talking about hiking up to the top of a mountain and taking 3 weeks to dig into these. Although if you can do that,
hey, why not?
That,
yeah.
Right. Like if I could be in the mountains contemplating these things all the time, I would be. But it's that whole thing of like, even give him 5 minutes to be able to say, all right, Lord, what do you say about that?
Yeah.
Right.
So are you talking to like prayer, like just pray about it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's active prayer. I know I totally say that, but at the same time, some guys even have tough beliefs around prayer. Right? Because maybe somebody beat them up around prayer, or you're not, they believe, well, I'm not eloquent when I pray, so I'm not good at prayer. It's like, or
I don't need God's help. I can fix it myself.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All things I've said, by the way.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And that worked really well. So, sometimes he might bring a story to mind to help to displace that truth, or maybe he'll even remind you of why you started to believe that in the beginning. Right. And that's powerful.
Or bring somebody else into your life who can help kind of counterbalance.
Right. Absolutely. Displace it. But then there's also ways to say, all right, Lord, like, let's just say, I've just sales is on my mind. I'm not sure why, but maybe that's somebody that's listening to be able to say, maybe they need to sell something. Right. We all need to sell something.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, whatever, but maybe somebody that's listening is like, all of a sudden they're tasked with selling something, whether it's an idea, a product, whatever. And they've got a belief, I don't sell stuff. I'm not good at selling stuff. I've never been good at selling stuff, right? They have that belief, right? It's like, hey, that's understandable. Maybe that's actually even been true. But one of the things that I always say is, pray about it, but then also start to use some new words. So to be able to say, hey, if you want to say that, that's okay. But to say, I used to never be able to sell, but I'm learning.
Yeah.
I'm better today than I was yesterday, right? Those are truths your brain can get on board with. Those are truths your heart can get on board with, to be able to say, yeah, that might have been true, but it's no longer true. And I'm working on it every day. That's a little bit like if I said I'm not a worrier, there's a part of my heart that goes, liar. Right? But if I say I'm a recovering warrior and I'm not great at it, yeah, I'm not perfect there, but I'm better than I was yesterday. My heart, my mind say, absolutely, that is true.
Yeah.
And that propels me forward.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, because like you said, our inner dialogue, which is constantly going, like you said, thousands of words a day. Well, maybe just changing those words is all we need to do.
It's catching ourselves. Even those things of just being able to say, you know, what is that thing you've always said about yourself, right? To be able to say, I've never been able to lose weight. I've never been able to be in good shape. I've never enjoyed reading the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? That may in fact have been true up to this point. But to be able to say, hey, I used to think this way. I used to be this way, but I'm changing and I'm getting better every day. Even as you say those things, right? Your body, your mind, they start to feel those things and start to react. Now, at the same time, it's a little bit like we talked about with the garden. If you close your eyes and you get a vision for a weedless garden, a flourishing garden, whether you're a vegetable person or a flower person, whatever, right? If you get that vision, that's great. Get that vision, get that clarity, but then get to work. So it's the same thing with these statements, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like if I say, I am a recovering warrior, I'm not perfect, but I'm getting better every day. Right? That's a part of the vision. And I'm starting to believe that, but I also need to take action.
Yeah.
I need to be able to say, all right, what's something that's going to prove that today? And it's that being able to say, all right, I'm not just going to say it. I'm going to take some action. Sometimes it might even be physically standing up, taking a deep breath and putting my shoulders back just to say, all right, there's action to those words. Or sometimes it might be signing up for something, or sometimes it might be doing something intentionally that I know I'm a little nervous about, sending that email, making that proposal, whatever that is, there still needs to be action. But these identity statements really can be a powerful bridge from where you've been to where you want to go.
I think that's a powerful point that you just made, in the fact that we've got to, like I said earlier, latch onto that vision, share that vision with God if God put it in your heart and in your mind, but then get to work. Because if we just stay in that visionary state and lose track of like reality, that's a dangerous place to be too, because then we're living in denial. So yeah,
that's so true. And I think, sorry to interrupt, but I so agree with you. And I want to go back to Joshua's story for just a second to kind of hit that home, what you just said, right? So when you think about it, God gave Joshua the vision of what the promised land is. Now, the Israelites made some mistakes, so they had to spend some time in the desert, right? But then when it was go time, what did he do first? He spoke vision to him and then spoke identity to him, saying, hey, be bold and courageous, for I am with you, right?
Yeah.
But then he had to take a step into the promised land. And what's beautiful about that journey specifically is each day, like Joshua had a vision for what the promised land was going to look like, but he had to depend on God day to day for the plan.
Yeah.
Right. And I think so often we're afraid to step more boldly into whatever God's calling us to because we don't have the full plan. We're not entirely sure how it's going to work out. Like we might have been given the vision, and maybe now you even you can feel a sense where he's changing your identity. Right. But because we don't have the full plan, we're not going to step out. And it's like, well, actually, that's not always how God works. It's usually not how he works, because he wants us to be partnered with him. And that means that's not checking in once a month or once a quarter or once a year. It's daily.
Right. Exactly.
So it's a whole part of this thing.
Yeah.
It all combines.
So guys, if we want to get anything out of these intentional identity statements, we've got to take steps forward and make some changes. So I'm going to go back to, we talked about journaling and praying. And so with those tactics, would you say that intentional identity statements remain pretty fluid throughout life, or have you run across any that have really stuck and you just continually go back to?
I think for me, God knows I have a short attention span. So I know some guys that I've talked with about this, whether they call it personal identity statements or not. There are certain beliefs that some guys, that are even good friends of mine have had a long time, and that's great. But I tend to let them be, they're a little bit more fluid with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I also say, like, that's a part of my prayer. Like, I've found that one of my challenges in the past is that my prayer life can kind of get old and stale.
Yep.
Right. Now I said that's been a problem that I've had in the past. Right. But one of the questions I have is, all right, Lord, what do you say today? Like, what are you saying about me today? What would you have me believe about today? And, it's interesting. I'll give you an example specifically this morning. It's kind of funny. He actually had me write it down as I was getting that. And, sometimes absolutely the short, the sweet is the best way to go. But today, literally, I got, Lord, create in me a pure, joy-filled, loving, non-judgmental, whole, generous, bold, forgiving, courageous, creative, and open heart today. I trust you. Let's make this an awesome day. That's literally the entry into my journal, right? And it was like, that's a long list. And I kind of got that the Lord was saying, you're going to need it. But it's like, how awesome is that? So it's kind of that old thing of, it's not about doing this perfectly or eloquently or making sure that each one of these things is, could be translated into a Hallmark card where people go, yeah. I think God's equipping us and wants to equip us for the thing you need today.
Yeah. Well, Mitch, if I may be so bold, I don't think it's an accident that you prayed that prayer and on the very day that you're on the Inspired Legacy podcast. Can I just put that out there?
I don't think it was any accident either. It's almost divine timing, right?
Boom.
I love it.
Well, hey, man, I know we're reaching the end of our time already. You have some interesting, I don't know how new this is, but it's new to me. You wrote a book.
Yeah, I've wrote a couple of them, but the most recent one is called Dream Job Redefined.
So tell us about that. I guess my first question is, and it's all about finding your dream job. Do dream jobs still exist these days?
I love that question. And the reason why we called it Dream Job Redefined was I set out to interview about 200 people who basically said they were either, they were in a dream job, right? Whether they found it or whether they created it, they were in a dream job. And what was interesting is that the reason why we call it Dream Job Redefined was that the definition for dream job really changed for different people. But the thing, like when we peeled everything back, it's dream jobs, at least by our definition, it's something you love to do, or it's something that allows you to do something you love to do.
Yeah.
Right. So it's one of those things. Now, there's a lot more to it underneath that, but we did find that a number of the people that I interviewed had found jobs or careers that they loved the work, like they felt created to do that work. But other people were really good at their day jobs and could actually find joy in them. But the thing that made them the dream job was that job allowed them to do something. Whether, in one case, I interviewed an extreme swimmer, and this is a guy who, like, for like a warm up, he lives in San Francisco. So it's that old thing. Most people train all year to swim from Alcatraz into the harbor, right? Like that's a thing. That's like a big thing. And for this guy, he would swim out to Alcatraz, swim around Alcatraz, and swim back. And that's like a morning swim. This guy's an extreme swimmer. Now, he's a corporate attorney, really good at what he does. But the dream that, what made his work a dream job was that it allowed him to swim. It allowed him, to take his family all over the world, swimming and scuba diving and all those kinds of things. So he said, I could sit in any meeting with a big old smile on my face because I knew what my job was doing. Right now, I think that when you dig into it, there's a lot around purpose and calling and all of those things. But sometimes it's a matter of simplifying things too. So we dove in and said, all right, what did it take for people to find these things or create these things? And we looked for the commonalities, and we were really able to actually find some very tangible things that people could do, steps that people could really take to uncover or rediscover their dream jobs.
Interesting. Okay. So, and I suppose folks need to read the book, to buy the book, to find out what those commonalities are, but that's good to know that they exist.
Absolutely. And they're there. And what's interesting, and of course, yes, buy the book. But I'll tell you, even one of the things, especially, with your listening audience, it's interesting because some of the people that we talked with, seasons was a really important thing.
Sure.
Because I think one of the wrestling matches when it comes to the subject of dream jobs is like, well, I don't know what my dream job is, or, it seems far-fetched from where I'm at right now. And to be able to say, okay, well, let's not say your dream job for your whole life, right? Most of these people, what's interesting is a lot of these people were in dream jobs, but that dream job was something they didn't even know existed when they started their journey, right? But also many of them had multiple dream jobs, meaning they had what was a dream job for a season in their life, but then later on realized, hey, that's no longer the dream anymore. I'm going to go and do something new. And that wasn't because they were flaky. It was because they were growing. It's because God was calling to something new, those kinds of things. I said a lot of the dream jobs that we talked about had back doors that led to new unseen dream jobs with some what we call bridge jobs in between, right? And nothing's wrong with a bridge job. It's one of those that it's oftentimes it's about the preparation of what it takes to get to that next thing. So there's a lot of real practical things. And what I love about the book too is we were able to take a lot of those recordings and then make them available. So I did the interviews, but in almost every case, almost every example, I was able to actually point to specific interviews that you can then click on the link and listen to as well.
That's awesome, man. Well, it sounds like an exciting book and very relevant in this day and age. I think you touched on a really important reminder there that our new reality is the fact that people, they're not at jobs 30 and 40 years like they used to be in the past. And it's okay to look at a job for a season, maybe it's just 2 or 3 years.
Absolutely. And to bring your best and to bring excellence, right?
Yeah.
And then if a shift, sometimes the shift was a choice. Sometimes the shift was thrust upon them. But, if you look at it in the right way, I mean, that's a number of the stories that we found. Many people uncovered a true fantastic fit, a great fit dream job because they'd been displaced from another. It's the catalyst was not of their choice, but man, it helped them to find something they loved.
Well, Mitch, as we wind down here, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know we talked offline that in preparation for this interview, some of my emails were not getting through to your team. So I don't know if you got this question, but it's a question I ask all of my guests. And as we've talked about intentional identity statements and how those can be a useful tool in our lives and kind of help us get pointed in the direction that God wants us to go, it ultimately leads to our legacy. When we think of legacy, everybody kind of has a traditional term that comes to mind. But when you think of an inspired legacy, and if you were to leave an inspired legacy behind, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, our family, if somebody asks me, what were you put here to do? What do you do? What's that thing? I think it's interesting because I just turned 50. So I just had my 50th birthday. And so that's one of those opportunities to reflect a little bit and that kind of thing. But, I've realized that, I was put here to help people figure out why they were put here. Right. But if you boil that down, it's, my hope as a husband and as a dad is to help my clan, right? The Matthews clan, to help us to be all that God created us to be, and then help others to do the same. And if you kind of look at all that we do, and if you look at all we do, it looks like I have a short attention span because we do a lot of different things, but all of them come back under that umbrella of doing our absolute best to do and be all that God created us to be and help as many others do that too.
Oh man, I love it. I love it. And through your podcast and the books that you've written, especially this new book, you are doing that. You are fulfilling that. And so where can people go online to learn more about what you've got going on and what you have to offer?
Absolutely. The easiest way to find out more is just go to mitchmatthews.com. We spent our entire marketing budget coming up with that domain name, Mark. So mitchmatthews.com with 2 T's and the Matthews. That'll help you find out about our podcast, which you can go to dreamthinkdo.com as well. That'll point you right to our podcast as well. But mitchmatthews.com will let you know about our books, our training, those kinds of things. So I love it. And I invite everybody to come. We've got a number of free resources too that people can get access to when they come over and check it out as well.
Outstanding. Well, we will link over to all of that in the show notes. Mitch, I really appreciate your time and really enjoyed this topic.
Thanks so much, Mark. You are an awesome interviewer, and it's an honor to be with your crew.
Man, I really enjoyed that. Mitch gives a great interview. Be sure to check out his book and his podcast. He's just got a ton of great information to share. I hope you guys took something away from this episode. I'm really going to noodle on how I can be better at defining my my intentional identity statement and how I can roll this into how I lead my family. I think there's opportunities for us to employ this same tactic when it comes to our families and our kids. And so I'm going to noodle on that. I hope you guys give that some thought. That's it for this episode. Thanks again for listening, guys. If you got anything out of today's message, remember, subscribe, leave a review, and share our message. Because when we work together to lift up fatherhood, we're going to change the world one dad at a time. Until next time, live inspired.